Hi, today is January the 17th, aka Blue Monday. And tell me, now, how do you feel? I hope you feel as good as New Order did in 1983 when they released their seminal dance tune, Blue Monday. It's, of course, one of the best dance records ever made, the perfect marriage of northern melancholy combined with Kraftwerky, Donna Summery, Italo-inspired robot funk. I think it's fair to say that one of the things that makes Blue Monday work so well is the choice of sounds that were included. Each sound is so distinct and complementary. They all work perfectly together like the pieces of a Swiss watch. And you have this really nice interplay between very staccato drums and synth sounds, and also these big, long, infinite sustained sounds from string machines. But also, and particularly for this video, I want to focus on that choir sound. What? This choir sound? Perhaps you recognise that sound from something because, of course, there is a legendary provenance to the sound of the choir sound in New Order's Blue Monday. What you hear on Blue Monday is the sincerest form of flattery because the band had bought EMU's emulator sampler, which was an early, affordable sampler. And I say affordable in the era where a Fairlight would have cost you as much as a house. An emulator would have cost you pretty much as much as a car, which is weird when you think of the fact that Ferris Bueller had an emulator too in 1985, and his parents refused to buy him a car. It would have been cheaper to buy a car. Anyway, of course, this burgeoning art form novelly allowed you to take sounds from anything and put them into your records. And that could be the sound of a turkey, or it could be the sound of a Kraftwerk record, because it's no coincidence that Blue Monday is deeply inspired by Kraftwerk as well as Italo Records and Donna Summer, so much so that it actually literally includes a part of a Kraftwerk record. And that record is Uranium, taken from 1977's Radioactivity. And there's this gorgeous, sustained choir sound that's built up like this. Later in the record, there are actually higher notes that I can't play all as one big chord on here, but I could cheat a little bit and I could just get this to play it for me like this. There's something so evocative about this particular choir sound. What's extra lovely about it is the fact that it doesn't decay. It just plays and plays and plays and plays. And so you can kind of like zone out in it. And what I love is playing with this particular sound here. I find myself just finding different chords and just letting them play and just kind of zoning out to them. And what's cool is this is exactly what Hutter and Schneider would have done when they were making the record originally. The sound itself lends itself to just these long, sustained sounds. And of course, this is begging the question, well, they didn't have a plug-in back in 1977 or 76. What were they using? And the answer is, weirdly, another form of sampler. They were using an instrument called a Vako Orchestron. Now, you may be familiar more with the Mellotron, and the Mellotron was an even more primitive form of sampler that used strips of tape. And the idea with the Mellotron is that when you held down a note, it played like a tiny strip of tape that had an actual recording of an actual instrument. And there is a very famous Mellotron sound you will probably recognize. That one. Gorgeous. And it's literally strips of tape, one for every note that you can play inside a Mellotron. So I mentioned Mellotrons because the Vako Orchestron used a similar concept, but in a slightly different way. And it was certainly inspired by the Mellotron. The Orchestron used discs. It used these big kind of LP-looking discs, but that weren't vinyl. They didn't use a groove. Instead, they had an optical track. So they had these infinite loops of optical sound. And optical sound is a bit of a weird statement, but it's the same technology that's used in 35mm motion picture projectable film. When you have a motion picture film, there is a strip of celluloid that's got the image, and on a side that you don't see, the soundtrack. And the soundtrack is actually a little wiggly optical strip. It's basically a picture of the sound wave, and by beaming light through it and picking it up on the other side, this technology can basically get the soundtrack off the film itself. And that's what the Orchestron is. It's a disc that has big loops of sound that little light resistors and pickups can sense and turn into sound. But what you're hearing here, this choir, wasn't originally released for the Orchestron, but for a thing called the Optigan, which preceded it. And the Optigan was a consumer-grade keyboard designed, actually, it was a subsidiary of Mattel, like the toy company, and they made this keyboard, the idea of which was that anyone could play music. And so the Optigan had keys that would create chords for you, and it also had things like rhythms and other funny things like this, for example. So that you could push down keys and kind of get presets. And the idea was that you could make music at home, just, you know, for your friends, entertain your friends. You don't know how to play piano, you just hold down a key. And as part of it, there was this choir. One of the things about the Optigan and the Orchestron as well is that there's a kind of band restricted quality, like it's frequency restricted, and it's very kind of grainy and evocative. And I think that's half of what makes it so sort of evocative, basically. There's a kind of otherworldly quality to those sounds. There's like a crackle and a noise in these recordings. And if you listen carefully to Kraftwerk's Uranium, you can hear that crackle as well. But before we go a layer deeper, there's actually one other Orchestron sound that you probably recognize if you're a Kraftwerk fan like me, and that's this. So good. I love this so much. It's so weird having the actual sounds, just something magical about having access to sounds that seminal legendary tunes are made from. Because a lot of these records do use presets or very simple sounds that can be recreated. And it's really fun. It's actually really useful to have a go at recreating tunes. It helps you understand some of the kind of constraints that were available and just how much that can be done with so little. And because, of course, we have so many amazing recreations of hardware in software these days, you've basically got all the tools that were used or recreations thereof in the modern DAW if you have the right plugins. And so what I've actually done here is I've had a go at kind of stepping into New Order's shoes. So to start with, what you have to do is you have to recreate the Uranium chord, which is this. And then we can re-record it internally. And I've actually already done that. I've got a little snippet here. So and then what we need to do is we need to dump it into an emulator, of course. And we don't have an emulator plugin per se. I do have an emulator 2 plugin. And this was the one that Ferris Bueller had. So slightly upgraded model, but, you know, idea is still the same. Although the emulator 1 is very primitive. Drag the sound in and we've got it here. So I've dragged it in and I can then just play it. So if I go over here, I've slightly filtered it. But on the record, it's actually a semitone up. That's what's on Blue Monday. And then what we do is we build it up. And of course, if you've like nerded out about Blue Monday before, you'll know some of the instruments, which is the DMX, that's the drum machine, the emulator, of course, but also the Prophet 5 is used a great deal, as is the Moog Source and string synthesizers. I think it's the Logan String Ensemble or Logan, I forget which one. It's like the original string machine that they were using. I don't know if they had a Selena, which is what I've got here. I'm using the ARP Selena. I'm using Yuhi's Repro 5, which is a gorgeous Prophet synth. And so let's hear what I came up with, which starts. And then. Now, that's not quite right. Because what we have to do is turn up modulation. And I've got the LFO modulating the filter. I actually think in the record they were potentially playing it by hand because the squelch is really well timed and is not quite what I have here. And then I'm also realizing like the sounds are slightly different. The bass sound is different from one section to the other. Now this guitar is not hooky. It's using the emulator, so it's not quite right. It's a slightly different sound, but you get the idea. Selena, and of course our friend the uranium chord, but in this instance of course played by the emulator. And you start to realize there's so much like getting it exactly right. This isn't exactly right. I'm hearing all of the subtle differences, the like spread of the delays. There's lots of like really short delays that are used on Blue Monday. And like, you know, the very particular settings, even something as simple as just like the bass line, which currently I've got playing a Diva, that's not exactly right as well. It's really instructive. Like, the sounds that are in Blue Monday are super specific, and if you don't get them like within 3% of the correct settings, then it feels slightly off. It's something as simple as this. It's really hard to get right, and that tells me how well chosen and specific the sounds actually are. And so that sound, this choir, we've been playing with it. We understand that it was a Vako Orchestron, and we understand that the Orchestron weirdly used recordings and then it was sampled. This legendary sample is itself made with a kind of sampler. So let's deconstruct this and go as far as we possibly can here. New Order legendarily uses a sample of Kraftwerk's Uranium. Kraftwerk's Uranium chord was made on a Vako Orchestron. The Vako Orchestron used discs that contain actual recordings of a choir. So then, where's that actual choir from? Where was that recorded and by who? And the mad thing here is that there's actually some amazing evidence about where it was recorded. There is a musician in the US called Pea Hicks, and P maintains an absolutely incredible website and kind of online business at Optigan.com. P is an Optigan ambassador, basically. And there are many amazing things that P. Hicks is responsible for. But perhaps one of the most amazing to me is that P actually owns the master recordings for the Optigan libraries. That is, P has got the tapes that were turned into those flexi discs that the Optigan played and that Kraftwerk in turn would have played. And there is a specific video where P talks about that choir sound as well. And in this video, P discusses the tape itself. He says it's from a company called Melody Recording Services Incorporated. It was based in Atlanta, Georgia. It was originally a smaller tape. It was a 15 IPS tape. It was originally part of a set of tapes, and it's been spooled onto one big reel that he now has. And he has a photocopy of the front of the tape. And you can see that it says 15 IPS, Vako Rs. That's that sound. But the most interesting thing of all is how P talks about how it's arranged on the tape. It has 35 distinct samples and each is around 8 seconds long. That's the structure of a Mellotron tape bank. Mellotron tapes were up to 8 seconds long and there were 35 of them on certain Mellotron banks. So the implication is that this Vako Orchestron sound that we love is actually taken originally from a Mellotron bank. So that the source of this legendary sample is itself sampled from a Mellotron. Now, P himself is also a Mellotron aficionado and noted that there's no Mellotron bank that we are aware of that has this particular arrangement of choir. There are lots of choir sounds for the Mellotron, which are really nice as well, but not like this exact particular choir. So it's unique, which is curious. And so I actually wrote to P. Hicks to ask him, have you had any update since 2017 when you released this video? Has anyone got in touch with you? Have you found the choir sound on a Mellotron tape bank? And P said, no, unfortunately have not. There is no one who's come forward with information about this bank. And so I also wrote to Dave Spiers, and Dave is the legend behind GeForce, and I'm showing GeForce's Mtron Pro here, and these sounds, these choir sounds are all available for Mtron. So there are links below, of course, to that if you're interested. And Dave said no, but interestingly notes that original Mellotron maker Les Bradley was always creating different blends of tapes for the Mellotron. So it could have been a bespoke choir mix for a Meli user that's never seen the light of day, which is interesting. Like this idea that there are custom Mellotron tape banks that might be out there that perhaps we don't know of, that aren't part of these amazing libraries. And so I did a bit of digging a bit further to try and understand more about this Melody Recording Service Incorporated company in Atlanta, Georgia. And I found a company record saying that Melody Recording Services actually went out of business in 2001. And the listed CEO was a T.G. Wright and an agent was T.G. Wright Jr. Now, it was very surprising after a very short amount of Googling, all of about 10 seconds, to discover an obituary for a T.G. Wright Jr. who died in March of 2008. And that person is a guy called Tom Glenn Wright. Tom was the studio owner of Melody Recording Services Incorporated. He was a self-taught recording engineer who literally built his own recording console, amplifiers, EQs, and then later these amazing microphones and speakers, which were called Wright microphones and Wright speakers. Apparently quite legendary in their own sort of niche world. But his obituary, which is very interesting reading, and he seems like a fascinating, colourful chap, it says that Tom was producing tapes for use in the Mellotron, a tape-based keyboard, the first system to provide strings, horns, and perhaps choirs, to artists in a keyboard format. Tom made virtually all the tapes used in the US by such artists as the Raspberries. So, Tom was an inventor. He made stuff himself and he made Mellotron tape banks. So lensed through this fact, I think it is extremely probable and certainly possible that the Mellotron tape choir, this magical Mellotron bank that we don't know from anywhere else, was potentially constructed by Tom himself, Tom Wright Jr., and was then transcribed and then sold on to the makers of the Optigan and the Orchestron, who will be looking for original sounds to include on their new machine. And I wrote to Dave Spiers just to say that I'd found this record of Tom Wright and kind of does this spark any knowledge? Do you know who this is, etc.? And Dave said, the theory about custom tapes kind of makes sense to me because when I first started hanging out at a studio owned by a prog rocker back in my teens, 1979-ish, one of the first things I witnessed was said prog rocker smashing milk bottles and hitting concrete and recording it to a Revox. I was intrigued and he told me, everyone's doing similar because the Mellotron sounds are overused. He then gave me the job of splicing up the tape and transferring it to a Mellotron M400 tape frame, and after a torturous few days of cursing and swearing, when I replayed the tapes on the Tron, I finally got it. A few years later, I was at Martin Rushent's studio, name drop, with his synclavier, nice, and thought, oh, that Mellotron work was effectively sampling in a non-digital way. It's funny to discover that most well-known and legendary sample that New Order made is it of itself a sample of a sample. And actually, if you think really, really hard about all the generations of recording that have to take you from the original Gregorian choir being perhaps recorded by Tom Wright in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the sort of mid-70s or early 70s potentially, you have to go through about 13 different generations. You go from the actual human choir to a master tape, and perhaps more generations if blended with other sounds. You go from a master tape to a Mellotron tape rack that Tom may have made. You go from this Mellotron tape rack to a master tape, which is now in Pea Hicks' possession. You go from the master tape to an Orchestron disc, perhaps with a mastering stage in between. You go from an Orchestron disc into a multi-track tape being played by the beautiful hands of Ralph Hutter in Klinklang Studio in Dusseldorf. And then you go from that multi-track tape to a master tape. You go from that master tape because you have to master it into the final record that then gets transferred onto a cassette or a record. And then you go from the vinyl record or a cassette to an emulator in Manchester, by New Order. And then you go from the emulator onto a multi-track tape. You go from the multi-track tape onto another master tape. You go from the master tape onto the mastered tape. And then you go from that mastered tape to a vinyl record that you proudly hold with its beautiful cover in 1983. And you've got Blue Monday. 13 generations of recording at least. It's amazing that it doesn't end up as white noise by the end. But isn't audio recording technology amazing? Even back then, it is amazing. So yeah, that's a bit of detail about that particular sound and a kind of preponderous meander on a cold, depressing Blue Monday. Maybe not so depressing. We've got lots of nice plugins to play with. We can shut the curtains, we can fire up our plugins, and we can make music. And that's not so blue. So yes, if you would like to check out Mtron Pro, which is great, get yourself Mtron Pro Complete that's got all of the sounds, including the famous Optigan and Orchestron sounds that we've been playing. I'll link to that and the Prophet plugins and loads of other good stuff that you may be interested to play with below. Now, how do you feel? I feel great. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.